Hey everybody, it is Tuesday night and it's time to take another trip around the world. It's been a little while since we've done that, so we're going to play catch up tonight. We got a lot to go over. I've been busy down here, especially today. So my 29 miscellaneous got a nice big fat water change today. I did not wipe down the glass, but I did change the filter. I removed a few little dead fronds from the Java fern in there and a few other little odds and ends like that. But one of the things I found interesting was the filter intake had a bunch of green gunk stuck all over it, and I kind of thought it was the green cyanobacteria stuff that I deal with in so many of my tanks. But as I began trying to wipe it off and get it cleaned up, it began to seem more like it was my Marimo moss ball, like chunks of my moss ball had broken off and gotten stuck on the filter intake. And I really think that's what it was. The way the moss balls work in nature, where they come from, they only come from one place, and they get just the right amount of sun and water current and all that stuff that they wind up getting the air bubbles all over them. They get the purling all over them. They rise to the surface, the air bubbles pop, they sink back to the bottom, and then they repeat this cycle all day long while the sun's shining, and that gives them that nice rounded shape, and it keeps them growing in all directions. So if you just have one sitting in the corner of your fish tank, like I've had for years in this tank, it doesn't grow right anymore. And I think that's what was happening. It was sort of starting to grow in all directions, but not in the proper round sort of way. A moss ball is not actually moss, it's a macroalgae. And it won't grow in a ball if it's not rolled around continually and given light from all directions and sitting on the bottom in all directions and that sort of thing. So I wound up taking it out of the tank. It sort of flattened out in my hand. It felt kind of weird and mushy, but it is still living plant material. So I put it in my quarantine tank that has the two coolie loaches living in it. I guess they're still in there. You never see them, so you never know. They might not be in there anymore. So I did that, and then I also took the last few remaining guppies that were in that tank right there, and they have now been moved into that quarantine tank. So I now have some tiny, tiny little resident guppies in that quarantine tank, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So that's the beginning of the video. That's all we've done to my 29 miscellaneous. We've got the little area in front of my 29 cleared away again. We're still working on clearing up some of the rocks that were in that tank, but I'm getting back to where I've got a fish room that I can actually walk around and not be tripping over stuff and climbing over things and everything else. So moving on to my 55-gallon Bahrami tank. I'm not sure what we went over last time I shot video on this tank, but not a lot going on fish-wise. I have put that angelfish in there, but I think that was a while ago. I'm pretty sure I've covered that in the most recent Round the World update. If not, I put that angelfish in there. That was once in the 29 miscellaneous we were just looking at, but both of those fish were getting a little too big for that tank, so the angelfish is now in this tank. Other than that, again, not a lot going on fish-wise. I have been working on trying to get the tank cleaned up. It had all that green, scummy growth in there. I have cut down on feeding. I'm trying to cut down on the amount of the green hair algae that's just sort of exploded into this tank. You can see that leaf that my chocolate gourami is drifting under right there looks furry. It looks like it's got green velvet on it. And that's that algae. I mean, you can see it growing all over everything. That's not cyanobacteria. That's definitely green algae. And I'm not quite sure why I'm having an outbreak of it. I've got this stuff growing in several of my tanks now, and I'm going to have to start figuring out something to do to deal with it. So that is about all I can think of that's going on in here. I did throw a bunch of those guppies in this tank too. I don't know if you've noticed how many more guppies are swimming around in here. And there are some endlers, and there are males and females. So they'll probably be breeding in this tank. Well, they'll definitely be breeding in this tank. There's no probably about it. But you can see that angelfish right there is going to make short work of any of the babies. Plus, I've got all of the gouramis in here. We'll go after all the little fry, and I won't have to worry too much about that. This angelfish itself right here has already reduced the number of little fish that I put in there quite a bit. So no worries about the tank getting overrun with guppies again. Moving on to my 55-gallon Tbar tank. I can't stand directly in front of this one anymore because of the Very loud waterfall you can hear behind me now. I'm not sure what we covered last time on this tank either, but my Tbar is getting better. Haven't really seen too much more in the way of that hole in the head spreading around. I have seen a little pockmark here and there. They sort of come and go, but it doesn't seem like it's anything that's getting worse. So I'm okay with that. I just did a water change last night. You can see I've already got big strings of poop accumulating again already, and it's from that pleco that's in this tank. It's just a big fish and it needs to sort of move on. I need to do something about getting that out of here, so that's going to be a project we'll be dealing with one of these days here pretty soon. I've cut some of the Anubias out of there. I know it doesn't look like it, but I've trimmed the Anubias back as much as I can. I've got a few people that have asked for some, so I've got that off in the mail. And you can kind of see now where it's clearly multiple plants in there. This plant down here is completely separated from the rhizome on this end. This is a completely different plant here. And then, of course, down here we've got another one altogether. But I have cut some trailers off of both of these rhizomes. I've also got in there, I don't know if you can tell up here, I've cut a few flower stalks that were starting to form on there. I've cut them off. And that looks like about it. I can't think anything else really to go over in this tank. If we look right underneath of this piece of rock here, where you can see the Synodontis on top of it, underneath of it should be the pleco. I can see its fins in the back. It's my little Siamese algae eater, but if you can see that little fin sticking up right there, that's the pleco lying across the back, and it's getting really big. So it's definitely time to move on from this tank. So moving on from this tank, we're going to come over here to my 40 breeder black ghost knifefish tank. Nothing that I can really think of going on in here. Probably need to do a water change on it. That's usually the case with most of my tanks. Otherwise, everything in this tank is looking pretty good. I do need to get in there and do something about the surface skimmer. The surface skimmer doesn't work really well anymore, and so I usually leave it uncapped. And what happens is either little fish or the snails will crawl up to it. They get caught in that suction, and it sucks their insides out of their shells, or, you know, the fish get trapped and stuck against it and it kills them. So I've got that plugged off, and now I've got very little surface agitation and no surface skimming, and the result is I've got biofilm building up all over the surface, and that's just not good for gas exchange. Even if you got a lot of circulation moving around the tank, if you've got a scummy film covering the tank and covering the surface of the tank, it's just not good for... You see how it's got that sort of film on there? Let me see if I can hold the... There you go, you get a little look at how that film breaks up. Good surface agitation will keep that film broken up, and it won't create this sort of complete covering like you see down here. And that covering really does hinder the amount of gas exchange you've got. So even though you can see I got a lot of water swirling around the tank and I've got the power head in the back, if the surface is covered with a layer of oil, which is what that is. It's a biofilm. It's a natural oil that develops just from the organic processes that are going on in the tank, and that can block, you know, gas exchange. That can be a significant factor in you know, how well your tank is oxygenated. So I need to do something about getting my surface skimmer going again, or maybe even simply put an air stone in the back. This tank is so heavily planted. If I had an air stone in the back by the power head, I probably wouldn't even notice it was in there until bubbles started developing on everything, and then I'd wind up hating it because I really don't like bubbles in an air tank. I mean, in a fish tank. So anyway, moving on. That's all I can think of to talk about with that tank. My 125-gallon native tank, the only thing I've got going on in this tank is the fact that I got in here and I removed all of the rosy side dace and I removed all of the Notropus species. There was only 2 of them in here, so that wasn't really a lot to remove, but it was really easy. I just got in here and sort of netted them out, and they kind of swam right in. I used the 2-net method, use one net to sort of corral them towards the other, and they got right in that current and swam downstream right into the net, and I put them in the other tank, and then they promptly have all pretty much died over the last couple of days, but we'll talk about that later. More on that when we get to that tank, and then a lot more on that when we do another video talking about why they all died and whatnot. So back to this tank. I've talked recently about switching this over to a South American cichlid tank. I feel like I'm misleading people when I say a South American cichlid tank. I always point out that what I want to put in here is a pair of pike cichlids. Not entirely sure of the species. I've got my eye on a couple, but if I put a pair of pike cichlids in here, that's going to be the South American cichlids that are in this tank. That will be the South American cichlid tank. It'll be the pair of pike cichlids. I will also be putting my striped Raphael catfish, my black ghost knifefish, maybe even that big pleco we were just talking about might go in here. So those would all be fish that could go in a tank with a mated pair of pike cichlids. You can't really keep a lot of other fish in a tank this small with a full-grown, pair of pike cichlids. The moment they start spawning, they'll kill everything in the tank. They're a very aggressive fish. And feeding-wise, even these minnows in here, maybe some of the very biggest ones might be able to survive, but I think even a lot of these will get eaten by a full-grown pike cichlid. They're very aggressive fish. So that's what I'm talking about when I say making this into a South American cichlid tank. It would probably be more accurately described as like a monster fish tank. It would just have a pair of really big pike cichlids in it, and then it would have some catfish and stuff living in the caves on the bottom trying to lay low and stay out of everybody's way. So that's all I've got going on in this tank, really. Nothing else, just giving you a little look at the tank. We will keep it this way at least over the winter. I've got no money or anything to even think about starting to move fish around and buy new fish to get out of this tank, so no hurry on that. We will definitely be enjoying this tank all winter, and by next spring, who knows how I'll feel or what I'll be in the mood to do. So take all of this with a grain of salt. But we've at least got this tank to enjoy throughout the rest of the winter. And it's really going to break my heart getting rid of that creek chub. This chub is so big now. I've watched it grow up from a normal size creek chub to this beast. And I'm really kind of growing attached to it. And these white suckerfish too, the ones with that downward facing mouth, I got a pair of them in here that never usually survived. And yet a pair of them survived in here, and I've watched them grow up into be quite large little suckerfish there. So, I'm not in any hurry to break this tank down. It's kind of lost its zeal, though. I really want to do something different with it. Who knows, maybe in the springtime we will put some small bluegills or something in here. The size of these fish, any bluegill that would go in there would certainly not be a threat to them. Again, who knows? We got plenty of time to worry about that, so I'm not going to sit here and talk about it until next spring. I'm going to move on to my snail tank. Lots of snails going on in here. Got good breeding going on. The trick is to stay ahead of the shrimp. I've got 2 ghost shrimp in here, and they eat the snail eggs, and they eat the little baby snails. So as long as I put lots and lots of food in there, the snails breed rapidly. I mean, you can see the pile of... That's all snail poop, all of that mulm down there. That all basically is coming from the snails, and there's lots of it. And if you look right in the corner, you can see one of those ghost shrimp. So as long as I make sure there's plenty of food in there, enough to stay ahead of everybody, then they continue breeding and growing, and we're good to go, and I don't seem to have anything to worry about. My purple spotted gudgeon tank, I had to find the fish there for a moment, just sitting up here in the corner looking like a silhouette like it normally does. Nothing going on in this tank, haven't done any water changes, haven't done anything. It's really a low stocking density. It's the, fairly sizable gudgeon you got up here. And then I've got a little bumblebee catfish that lives in that cave down there in the corner. And I've got a little rubber lip pleco that I see out from time to time. And I did just notice the other day when the rubber lip pleco was out, as soon as that gudgeon saw it down on the bottom of the tank, it darted after it and like took a swipe at it, and the pleco darted underneath the rock and hid again. So that pretty much ruins any, thought of... every now and again, I just keep thinking I'd really like to put something else in this tank, but I just don't know what I would put in this tank. I used to have my Tbar in here, so it's not a matter of how big the fish is. I had to get the Tbar out of here because it was getting injured because this gudgeon was just banging into it and knocking scales off of its side. So it's not a matter of being big enough to not get eaten. It's just a matter of this fish isn't going to have anybody else in the tank with it. And so we're just sort of stuck having this rather pretty but boring fish tank. I think it's an attractive looking tank if you can sort of not look at the glare we're seeing from other tanks in it. But, attractive isn't the same as interesting and exciting. And that purple spotted gudgeon, as interesting and exciting as you might think that fish is, just really isn't. It just kind of sits there and does what you're seeing it do right now all the time, until feeding time, of course, and then it becomes very active and interesting. So moving on to my 125-gallon tank. I can no longer stand directly in front of this one either, so we can just sort of start by talking about this end of it. And at this end of it, you'll notice I've got that green furry algae growing all over everything again, and I'm not sure where it's coming from. I just treated this tank with the ChemiClean, and I got rid of all the scummy stuff I didn't want in here, but what I wound up with was all of this green algae growing all over everything, and it's just too much. I don't want my tank looking like it's covered in green velvet. I do go on about how much I enjoyed the 70s, but, that was then. I don't really want a green velvet tank. But I'm not sure why it's doing that. It's definitely got something to do with treating it with the ChemiClean. It's just a perfect example of how delicate of a balance everything is in a fish tank. All I did was treat to get rid of all the scummy stuff I didn't want, and now I'm getting all these weird backlash sort of repercussions of a bunch of other type of growth that I didn't want, and it's just because I've changed the chemical balance of what's going on in a tank. I don't know how or what. I'm not exactly sure of what I've changed, but getting in there and killing off all that other stuff. I had the air stone going in the tank, and that of course changed the way the gas exchange normally happens in this tank, and all of that stuff changes the chemistry in a tank. And when you make a sudden shift and change things in a tank, you will see very quickly that things change within the tank. I love watching my two, I call them my odd couple. I've called them my odd couple for years. I bought them both when they were teeny tiny little fish, and they've grown up together. When they outgrew their first tank, they moved into this tank together at the same time. And they've always had this sort of playful rivalry. Again, I don't like ascribing, human emotion and human behavior onto animals, so I say, playful very loosely there. I don't mean that specifically, but they do seem to have this sort of playful kind of behavior where they're not really aggressive, but at the same time they're sort of acting that way. Again, I've always just sort of called them my odd couple. It seems like they pal around the tank together, the way old friends might. They're sort of fussing and cranky with each other, but ultimately they always hang out and they always get along, and they always seem to ultimately enjoy each other's company. So I always like watching those two interact. See what I mean? They always just find their way back to each other. Absolutely love them. So, did a big water change on this tank tonight. I wiped the glass down. The glass was covered in all that green algae. You could barely see into the tank. It looked like a swamp. But once I got the glass cleaned up, I realized it's not as bad as I thought. I still do need to get in there and clean up. This fern that we looked at has got that growing all over it. My Java Windelov up here has the green sort of fuzzy algae growing all over it. So maybe I'll get some more Siamese algae eaters, not Chinese algae eaters. Definitely not getting any more Chinese algae eaters. But maybe I'll get some Siamese algae eaters or flying foxes for this tank. The only problem is I've got to get something that Tenopoma won't eat. And that Tenopoma tends to eat anything it can fit in its rather spacious mouth. So if I got some flying foxes or some Siamese algae eaters, I'd prefer the Siamese algae eaters. But if I got them, I'd have to get some full-grown ones or some pretty substantial ones in order to get them in here big enough that they wouldn't get eaten by that Tenopoma. So moving on to my 20-gallon angelfish tank. Just did a water change on this tank tonight as well. Didn't wipe the glass down or anything. I just did about a 50% water change. This is one of my more neglected tanks, and when I do a water change on this tank, I tend to make it fairly significant. I know in light of recent events, we're going to be talking very soon about the importance of not doing huge water changes if you're not really familiar with what's going on with your water. If you take fish from one set of parameters and you change them into a new set of parameters, you can kill them very quickly, as I did with both my guppies and the minnows that I took out of my native tank. When I put them into my waterfall tank, I killed a lot of fish doing that. And again, we'll get into why that is in another video. I've given it some thought and done some research, and I've come to some fairly obvious conclusions, but we're going to have a nice long video about that, and we're going to talk about that because I want to talk about nitrates and nitrate shock and total dissolved solids and pH and all kinds of good stuff is going to be in that video. So make sure you're subscribed and you won't miss that. That will be coming up very soon. I just got to get my ducks in a row and sit down and actually record that one. I've tried quite a few times now, and I keep... Oh, look, there's a coolie loach swimming around, so there is at least one of them still in there. Look at him go. So I did a water change on this tank tonight, too, because this is another very neglected tank. It's only got those two little coolie loaches in it, so it's not like it has much bio load. I only put a pinch of food in here every other day. But I also released a few little guppies into this tank because this tank was already very, we'll say, nitrate rich. I didn't think there would be too much shock on the guppy system by putting them in here. So I put 2 or 3 little tiny fry in here. I mean, they could get down between the gravel on the bottom would be like boulders to them. So whether we see them or not, I don't know. They might have got sucked up the filter for all I know. But theoretically, we've got a couple tiny little fry swimming around in this tank somewhere, and we can still see that coolie loach sitting out, so I rarely ever get to see them. Maybe because of the water change, that one at least is out. So there should be 2 of them in there. There was before, but now we're down to the 1. That is my Marimo moss ball back there. You'll see the sort of brown side. It looks like a 2-sided sponge. The bright green was the outside, and it just sort of unrolled and went from being a ball to being, man, I've never seen this coolie loach that out and about. That water change is either not good for it, as I was just saying. Maybe I did too much of a water change and it's going through a little bit of irritation. Or maybe it's just out looking for food since it got a bunch of fresh water in the tank. I don't know. But I did about a 50% water change on this tank too. Again, probably not enough to throw the fish into any kind of shock, but it is unusual to see them out and about. Now, I will say when they are out and about, that's the behavior I usually see, which is why a coolie loach is another fish I'll never buy again. Not really digging the way these, well, I guess I should say this, because I don't say these anymore. I've only ever seen one at a time for quite a while now, so I'm beginning to think maybe there's only one left in this tank. Until I see both of them together, I'm going to assume there's only one in here now. But at any rate, my moss ball right here, if you can see that, it basically just sort of unrolled and now it's just flat and sort of standing up. I also did take all of this fake plant right here. It did have some of that green cyanobacteria growing on it, so I took that in the other room, put it in a tub with some hydrogen peroxide and scrubbed it off and rinsed it off in some really hot water and got all that junk off of there and then put it back in the tank. So now we've got a little bit of a live plant, and we've got a clean water change and all that good stuff going on. I did change the filter, and I even rinsed out the biofilter a little bit, which was so, it had been so long it was kind of clogged up, so we got all that taken care of. So almost last, but definitely not least, is Butterbean's tank. He got a water change last night too. He's hanging out in his little corner back there where he likes to sit underneath of the heater. He also spends time up in this front corner, if you can figure out where. He likes to sit right in that corner, and then when he darts and dashes away, he kicks up the gravel and leaves a little bare spot for himself. But he likes to spend his time in that back corner too, and that's not really him hiding from me necessarily. If I just poke my head in the room and look in there, that's often where he hangs out. He just kind of likes it back there. And then of course his little cave right there in the middle is where he spends most of his time. So he's doing pretty good. I think that the sort of white marks on him that I've not been able to identify, they almost look like they might be clearing up. At the very worst, they're not getting any worse. I'm not seeing them expand or get any bigger. I don't know where he's gone to. He's in the back hiding behind those bushes somewhere. But he's looking good. He's looking a lot better. I don't see his belly being as dark anymore. So perhaps my slightly stepped up maintenance routine on this tank is doing some good for him, and he's feeling a little better or something. I got in there the other day with a gravel vac, and I sucked a bunch of those clumps of cyanobacteria off the bottom. You can kind of see that red right there is some that I missed, but that's okay. That's no biggie. There was a bunch of it sort of covering the leaves on some of the fern. You can kind of see some of it back there that I missed, that bright red stuff. There's Butterbean. So tonight he got himself a dinner of his freeze-dried krill. I'd run out the other day, so he's been eating nothing but shrimp for the last several days. I'm sorry, nothing but snails for the last several days. And he really likes his floating freeze-dried krill. And he was begging like a puppy tonight, so I've already given him his dinner. And that's why you can see that sort of fat round belly. That's probably why he's hanging out in the back there. He's had his dinner and now he's just chilling. So when I was in there, I got the siphon, I went over and I removed a bunch of the red growth that was on top of all of the leaves and everything. And once again, we're just keeping on top of it. It's all just part of the maintenance of this tank. Eventually, it'll get on top of me again and we'll have to do another treatment. But, you know, that'll be months down the road. And if I got to do a treatment on this tank a couple times a year, that's no big deal. It's all just part of having to do tank maintenance, you know. But today or yesterday or whenever it was, we just did a simple water change. I wiped the glass down and that was it. We didn't even get in there and do a filter change or anything on this tank. I did get a bunch of the dead snail shells off of the bottom too, if you'll notice how much cleaner the bottom looks, and some of the gravel that had been removed before got put back in. So that's all that we've got going on with that. And finally we will turn around and have a look at the waterfall tank. First of all, let me show you my new sort of temporary lighting. It's a LED. It's only 11 watts, but when I'm trying to shoot video of this tank, the real LED, the grow light over here, is just so intense that it makes it almost impossible to even get video of it. So this light gives me a nice bright light. I also like the way it's offset at an angle. It gives me a completely different set of shadows and texture, and it gives me much more visual depth. And I know here on the two-dimensional camera it's a lot harder to tell how much visual depth you get there, but those shadows, I'm trying to give you a little bit of motion parallax, as it's called. By moving back and forth like this, it allows you to see the depth a little more, where you see the movement of some things that are closer to you versus the movement of things that are further away. That's called motion parallax, if you didn't know that. So this light allows me a little bit different perspective on the tank and all of its surroundings, but it doesn't really light up the tank very much. And look how tan and stained that water is. I just did a big water change again yesterday. I've been doing daily water changes on this tank, and that's how tan and stained the water gets in about 24 hours. So now I'm going to turn on the big light. And that's the real deal. That's the one that actually makes everything grow and look beautiful. And for a video like this, it's fine. But if I'm trying to video myself with this in the background, the camera doesn't know what to make of it. So not a lot to talk about here. I've done some videos already explaining all my little tinkering with this. I come in here every day and I tweak it a little bit. I move this and tinker with that, and I got my little spray bottle out that I make sure I spritz this little bit of moss down and that little piece down here and there. I've added some of this recently. I put some moss up here. I covered this whole section with moss fairly recently. I've added some more moss back there that's kind of hard to see on camera right now, and I've tweaked all this little stuff a bunch of times and tucked some stuff back in there and so on and so forth. So we're getting there. I really don't like this sort of big green ugly area right there, but it's an underside. I don't know what to do with it really, other than let all of this creeping Jenny, and you can see all that new growth is going to flow down. And it won't be long before this is going to be a big shaggy overgrown mess. All these philodendrons in here, all this stuff's going to start growing like mad, and then my dead nettles up here in this pot behind the whole thing is going to grow up and over. You can already see all these little shoots up here. That's all new growth. All we need to do is get some length on them and they'll start growing this way. Most of this is already dead and died off from neglect between you know, when I brought it inside and when I actually got it into a place like this where it's going to get some good light on it. So that'll all come back, that'll come together, and we're going to get a lot of really shaggy growth going on in here in the very near future. As far as what's going on in here, I did move a bunch of fish from the native tank and a bunch of those guppies. All of the guppies died and quite a few of the native fish died. There's one of them that I haven't gotten out yet tonight, and this one down here was just getting attacked by the crayfish. And I don't know if you can see the crayfish right there, but that was a little interesting saga that I was able to get on video. And by the time you're watching this, that video should have already been uploaded. So you can check out my waterfall tank playlist and you'll get to see all of the stuff going on. And here's a surprise: if you've waited all this time and you're still with me at the end of this video, there's my new fish in this tank. I was hoping we'd get an appearance by him. If you've made it past the half-an-hour mark, great, awesome, thanks. And there's your first sneak peek at my opaline gourami. I've been talking for a while about getting an opaline gourami, but I'm afraid to put it in my gourami tank for fear of it attacking my chocolate gourami and my more docile gouramis in there, because these opalines can get pretty aggressive. I got a male, and I decided that since this time of year it's going to be almost impossible for me to catch a sunfish or like a bluegill or something, that putting an opaline gourami in this tank is going to be just fine. It'll be a nice big specimen fish, it'll be really pretty, and it'll be attractive colors. And there's an extra awesome bonus. If you stuck around this long, you'll get to see a little bit of that crayfish. Oh, I thought he was going to start working on cleaning that fish up. So that gives you a pretty good idea of how crayfish tend to like vegetation more than they do the meat. They're not as much meat eaters as a lot of people think. He's over there cleaning through that the roots from that plant rather than eating that dead fish he's got right there in front of him. So that gives you a pretty good idea of how much crayfish are vegetarian based, not vegetarians in the sense that they don't eat meat, but they've got a much more vegetable based diet. So there you go, extra little bonus. You got to see my opaline gourami. Again, I'm not a stickler for these things being biotope tanks. I don't care if it's not 100% native. Now we're going to have a nice big pretty fish swimming around in there, so you can already see him doing his thing. So I'm really happy about that. So alright everybody, sorry this one was so long, but I got a lot going on this week. Again, thanks for sticking with me. If you did manage that whole time, there you get to see my legs. I do have pants on, as always. I promise you'll never see a video of me without having my drawers on, as has been mentioned in the past. So once again, if you made it this long, thanks again for watching. Make sure you're subscribed, and I will see you real soon on the next one.